Hello and welcome to the Fobia St. Dinfna Hotel Review, which is a really funny title, but that is the name of the hotel the game takes place largely in, except for the laboratory. I'm going to be going over this game in a few sections relating to atmosphere, level design, gameplay, and narrative, pretty much in that order. So firstly, I'll go by atmosphere. So what do I mean by atmosphere? Well, I mean the lighting, textures, visual effects, audio, whether or not it's 3D audio, how sufficient it is, the music, that type of shit. The overall general mood. Because just like if you just had got good with a good, just like if you just got done with a good date, right? You're expecting, maybe hoping to get laid, but you still have to set the mood anyway. It still has to be there, otherwise it destroys everything else. So, and especially when it comes to horror games, atmosphere is very important. So let's go over the atmosphere. First off, this is an indie game, which basically means it doesn't have the budget of your average AAA title, like, I don't know, Resident Evil 2 Reimagining. As such, I won't be comparing this to the likes of that per se, because it can't do as much. Gotta be totally fair here. So, taking this game on its own merits, as an indie game, its graphics are exceptional. Not compared to other games, but compared to what it is, its graphics are exceptional. The textures are well done. I didn't see any visual issues with it. And it plays nice and fluid. Some of the guns take a little bit long to switch through, and especially with the shotgun to reload. But I assume this is supposed to be a guy like Resident Evil 7, where he's never done this kind of shit before, so he's just kind of rolling with it. And in which case, even though it's a little tacky, it makes sense. So I'm willing to forgive it for that reason. Now, as far as other things like the lighting, to be honest, it's a very dark game, like lighting-wise. So there wasn't much in the way of lighting. The only real source of light was the flashlight, which I didn't even use because I would come with a flashlight, but I didn't really use it because I never needed it, so I just considered it to be a waste in my inventory when I can easily use something else. And then the other thing other than that would be the camera for the night vision, which I only ever used when I needed to get past or find a puzzle or whatever. So that's also a non-starter. So really, the only part that I can really mention for the lighting was the laboratory, and the laboratory was all right. So there's not much I can say about the lighting because it wasn't really there, but it suffices for what it did. I mean, I can't criticize a game for its lack of lighting if it's designed that way. I can only criticize a game for lighting if there's lighting there and it's done poorly. So it gets a pass from that automatically for me. So I suppose the last thing then for atmosphere would be music, which this game has basically none of. Now, having music isn't a requirement for horror games, even ones like this, but it is kind of an expectation to a degree. So why is an expectation to a degree? Because AAA horror games do not give a fuck about horror anymore, to be emphatic. It's a hit or miss. Silent Hill hasn't made a game in forever, and even some games like, say, Resident Evil, it's a hit or miss. You got games like Resident Evil 4, 5, 6 that aren't horror. You got games like 7 that are, and then you got games like 8, Village, that are just a composite of like 10 different games in one and makes it terrible by design, to me at least. So this game, like several others, one game I'll mention to compare to in specific is Tormented Souls, and I'll get more to that comparison later, is that it seems like it's trying to emulate more of the classic survival horror take. Well, the classic survival horror take does music, which Tormented Souls did exceptionally well, not this one. Now, I'm not going to criticize its lack of music because it doesn't need it. I'm just saying that a lot of games from this era that's trying to emulate used it. Now, the one piece of music this game did use, I remember there's two pieces. Actually, there's three pieces. One is the music for when the big fucker's chasing you. That music suffices for what it needs to do. It does. Another one is the final boss music, which suffices for what it needs to do. And then the final one is the save point. During editing, I may or may not insert it here. If I don't, you can probably find it on YouTube somewhere. But that particular one I liked. Because I did, like, every time I loaded into that game, I heard it immediately, and I enjoyed it. So for that particular part, I really like the music. So that is to say that the atmosphere suffices, but doesn't go above and beyond in any way. So there you go. It gets a C for atmosphere. So what about the next thing? Well, the next thing I'll talk about here is level design, which will segue nicely into gameplay whenever I get there. So level design, which should be self-explanatory as to what it is. You got two sections to this. You got the hotel and you got the laboratory. The hotel is straightforward. It's a motherfucking hotel. So the only way that the level design is able to change is by changing the makeup of the hotel. That meaning, of course, the camera, which the camera does change things, but changes things for the whole game. There might be a cabinet, and then you use the camera, and then all of a sudden the cabinet's gone, and then you can just move right through. But the hotel itself had to be changed into sort of a derelict. Certain paths being blocked off and whatnot, so that way you couldn't, like, if you were on the third floor and you wanted to go to the fifth floor, you couldn't just take the elevator and go up and go. Or you couldn't do that. Let's say if you wanted to go to a certain room, you had to do. It was basically a maze, right? The level design was essentially a maze, which is a positive and a negative. But in order to go to the positive and negative, that'll segue into the gameplay. So first, let me go ahead and talk about the laboratory. Laboratory, I thought, was actually pretty well done. You have the initial part getting the V123 keys, and then you have the second part, which is basically the Resident Evil 3 / In-Sound Mind puzzle again of getting the shit, which I thought was fine. I have no issues with that kind of puzzle. Then you have the final boss, that's pretty much it. So the laboratory does its job. Now there's one more part of this, which is the flashback stuff. The house was pretty good. That's all I can say about it for the 1920s stuff. The house level sufficed. The forest level sufficed as well. More into that in gameplay. And then the last part was the mine, which basically served no purpose. I mean, it served a purpose, but like level design wise, it didn't serve a purpose. Not even gameplay. The mine doesn't matter until you get the narrative. So there we go on that one. So level design did its job well enough. And I'm about to segue into gameplay a little bit. Before I do that, actually, let me add one more thing, and this kind of goes along with atmosphere and gameplay. Lack of jump scares. One thing I did notice about this game that I didn't mention at the time was that this game has like no jump scares. Here's my thing about jump scares in horror games. They can be good if well done. Not like Five Nights at Freddy's. That's bullshit. But it can be done if implemented well. Here's how I prefer my jump scares to be in a horror game. No more than 3 total, meaning like scripted jump scares. And of those 3, only a total of 1 should be from an actual enemy. So then how will the other 2 go? Atmospheric. When I say atmospheric, I mean like, let's say you're in a sewer, right? And a pipe bursts all of a sudden. That's a jump scare. So that's what I mean. No more than 3 of those. For example, a game that I consider to be the greatest horror game of all time, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which I've played. I have a playthrough on Mr. Flitch. That game has, I believe, 3 jump scares in the whole thing, and only one of them is enemies. So it perfectly exemplifies. I didn't create that rule because of it, but that's just my preference, and it met that preference. So I like that. This game has no jump scares, which some might say diminishes the horror value. I say it doesn't, because the thing about horror jump scares is the jump scare should not be the horror. The jump scare should enhance the horror. And it can only enhance the horror under certain circumstances. And quite frankly, even though this game meets the metrics gameplay-wise to be a survival horror game in general, it doesn't meet the horror metrics. But more of that in the gameplay side of it. So speaking of, let's go into gameplay. The level design, especially in the hotel, being blocked off and shit, is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it means that you can't just get to each level easily as hell. But it's also a bad thing in the sense that it strongly encumbers gameplay, especially due to the fact that you have no map. But there's a map in the hallway! Yes, I don't give a shit. I want a map I can carry with me. That game is way too much of a maze. And there are several lockboxes and whatnot to pick up that you find early in the game, but you can't access until later on in the game. And especially when you consider the fact that the elevator breaks down to the first floor later on in the game, It's such a pain in the ass to go down there and get the lockbox just for what, like some shotgun shells and one upgrade item? It just, there's not enough incentive. Like that's one of my complaints. There, like the game makes it so cumbersome to go backtrack once you've gotten far enough that the rewards it gives you aren't worth it. Like it's too easy to get lost. Now maybe that's on me. Maybe I just have a more difficult time with the level design shit than some people might, but that's still a problem for me. I mean, this is my review after all. It's a problem for me. I don't like that. In fact, like I said, when I was near the laboratory, I even went downstairs for that 4 symbol key thing in the library, whatever it was. It had like ammo and an upgrade item, and then I would have had to do some bullshit to get back up at the top. I said, fuck that shit. I just fucking loaded my game back up. I didn't give a fuck. So one issue is the backtracking. This game, to me, gives no incentive for. It gives insufficient incentive for backtracking. It's just ridiculous. Like, and you'll be fighting more enemies along the way, trying to find your way back up to the top through the fucking mazes. You'll be expending more inventory capital than you gain. So it's just not worth it. That's one of my issues, and the lack of a map. I've played games with shitty maps. Tormented Souls is an example. Control Ultimate Edition is an example. This game doesn't give you a motherfucking map. And to be honest, I feel like even if it did give you a map, it would be just as shitty as either of the 2 games I mentioned just now. So how about the rest of the gameplay? Well, as far as horror goes, quite frankly, there isn't much. So the classic survival horror gameplay is going around in environments, solving puzzles, fighting enemies with limited ammunition, limited health. You know, avoids of enemies is better than combat. In fact, I might put something in the description. I don't know if I can put a link to it. If I can, I will. But to another video from another creator on YouTube that actually exemplifies. He has a whole video, it's like a half hour, on what it means to be survival horror. If I can, I'll link to that video in the description. So it may or may not be there. Just to give further credence to what I'm talking about here. This game's gameplay simply emulates the meaning of the classic survival horror in that way. There's a lot of puzzles in this game. I mean a lot of them. But it still lacks the horror atmosphere. Now, even in games like OG Resident Evil 2 and 3, well, mostly 2, because 3 has a nemesis to back up its shit. But like with 2, you can argue that it doesn't also have that hallmark. Now, and today it doesn't. If you were to play Resident Evil 2 OG for PS1 right now in 2022, unless you're like 10 years old, maybe, it won't be scary. It won't be. But back when it came out, it was. And I know that because I was a child when it first came out, and I played it back then, and it was scary. This game, with very few exceptions, is never really scary. It contains all the hallmarks to emulate survival horror, but it's just not scary. And I think that probably has something to do with the atmosphere more than anything else. Like, the atmosphere suffices for what it is, but I don't think it's the best for a horror game. I think it maybe should have done it a little bit better for what it was aiming to do. But like I said, I already gave a little bit. It suffices for the most part of what it does. So here's another aspect of the gameplay too, is different. I'll go over the different levels. The hotel gameplay was well done. It wasn't horror, but it was well done except for the boss fights. The first spider was too much of a bullet sponge. Way too much of a bullet sponge. I had to turn on extra ammunition to be able to beat him, because I couldn't beat him without it. Call me a pussy if you want, I don't care. Like, I had, 8 handgun rounds and then like 2 shotgun shells to my name when I started that fight. And then it ended up taking like 32 shotgun shells or however much it was. I would not have beaten that game without that. Just saying. It was too much of a bullet sponge. The second boss was utterly worthless because all he would do is just jump from thing to thing on the upper level until you killed him. It was real easy. I mean, why even have that boss? And then the third boss fight was the most well done. He wasn't too hardcore, and the way to beat him was simple enough. That's all I got to say about that. Now let's go on to the laboratory. The gameplay was pretty. The gameplay in the laboratory was well done. That's all I'll say about it. For what it aimed to do, it was well done. By the way, I'm not going to go over, I'm not going to specify on certain things, especially when it comes to narrative, because this is a review. So quite frankly, if you're watching this, I assume you've already played the game. So I'm not going to go over certain things. I'm just telling you my thoughts on these things, and maybe you agree, maybe you don't. So that's for that go over to the gameplay. Now let's go for the house. The house was very simple, although it didn't make any goddamn sense. Oh, actually, I'll talk about that last. Didn't make any goddamn sense with some of these puzzles, which I'll get to later on, but the house was done well enough. The forest was extremely monotonous. Now, I will admit that this was a fuck up on my part anyway, because it tells you to hold down L2. I didn't do that. I just didn't think about it. So I was wandering around lost as to where the fuck to find the rest of those metal pieces. All you have to do is hold L2 and the waypoint guides you to it. To be fair to the game, that was my fuck up, so I'm not going to criticize it for that. I was originally going to tear this game apart for that, but I can't anymore because of it. Here's the thing though. Going from house to house like that to find a piece into is still incredibly monotonous. I get what the game was going for, and narratively it actually serves it rather well. But gameplay-wise, it was monotonous as hell. It really was, at least to me. Like even with the waypoints in mind, it was still monotonous. I just gotta say, it takes way too long. It's way too tedious. Like even the hotel only becomes tedious for the backtracking. That forest was tedious the whole damn time. Lastly, the mine. You walk through a hallway. That's pretty much all there is to it. Congratulations. So the next thing then is the laboratory. I already went over the laboratory. So last thing I'll talk about the gameplay is the puzzles. The puzzles were well done. I already talked about some of the puzzles briefly, but I want to go over a little more because I missed the point. Puzzles were well done for the most part, except two things. One, there are too many items that you can use once and never again. The crowbar is one of them. Well, I assume you can use the crowbar more often, but for some obscure purpose I just didn't find it worth it to do anything with. The rod to open the staircase. And then on top of that, there was also the chain doors that stop, which is contrived. Contrived puzzles is another one of my things here, because like the buttons, like I mentioned, if I'm in a puzzle, if I'm in an elevator, and I had the 4 key, and I want to go up to the 7th floor or 7th button, I can take that 4 button and put it in the 7th slot and just go to the 7th fucking floor. In fact, I probably don't even need to insert a fucking button. And that's a real big cliche of these horror games. I probably don't even need buttons. I can probably just push the fucking thing in. I mean, the button isn't what makes the technology. It's just the face of it. So a lot of this game is puzzles. And like the chain doors, all you have to do is reach your arm behind and fucking open this shit. Like a lot of this shit was very contrived in that way. But it is what it is. Now, a lot of games have ridiculous puzzles. Resident Evil 1, 2 certainly do. Resident Evil fucking Tormented Souls certainly did. But this game is just extremely contrived. Like, the one game that didn't have any backtrack problems was Resident Evil 3 OG because of Nemesis. If I didn't mention that already. But that's pretty much it for gameplay. I don't really have anything else to add for that. It's good enough for what it does, but in certain areas it lacks a bit. So now let's go ahead and talk about the narrative. This is going to be the weird part of it because the narrative is very confusing, and unless it's imperative, I don't look up other people's reviews or whatever for the narrative. If I don't understand it, then I blame the game for that. Or you can blame me if I miss something, but I'm going to go by what I perceived from this fucking narrative. So the narrative is confusing a bit. You got Stephanie, who calls what's-his-face Roberto in. And you get Christopher, who's at the front line. Stephanie's working for Christopher. And then he's there for like a week or however long it was, a week or two. Stephanie stops contact because she doesn't give a shit anymore. He's already where he needs to be. Shit gets fucked. The daughter unwittingly brings him to the future or something like that. And then he gets to the laboratory because Stephanie manipulates him into it. And then at the end of the game, it turns out that there's some sort of cult, which is what ties in the past part of the gameplay into the mix, and then it's Christopher there, and then there's some contrived choice between whether you follow Christopher or not. I chose to follow Christopher simply because I felt like he was going to be a boss fight. I didn't have any interest in another fucking boss fight after the one I just got done doing, so I said fuck it. So there's that. But that's pretty much all I got for the narrative. It wasn't exactly clear cut. And honestly, and here's where the comparison comes in for Tormented Souls again. So here's why I compare it to Tormented Souls. Tormented Souls, you have a girl who goes to a hospital, an old rundown hospital, to try and find somebody and work with somebody to find some children. Gets mixed up in this cult run by somebody who the player is familiar with and has been talking to. And at the end of the game, turns out there's a part of a cult, and then the guy you meet at the beginning is the same guy who's in charge of the cult, and then the person you were trying to work with has something to do with it as well. And then they die, whether it's from you or not, depending on the ending. Here's why I described that. What I just described was the basic narrative for Tormented Souls. 95% of what I just said is also the basic description of the narrative for this game. Which is quite frankly why I didn't find it to be very compelling. The only real difference, well, besides the whole sister thing for Tormented Souls, the only real difference between these games narratively is that one actually gives some sort of reason for the cult, which is that the whole immortality thing and putting the orb alongside it. That's pretty much it. This game, narrative-wise, is basically Tormented Souls Part 2, just to be honest with you. So, here's how I'm going to put it. The narrative is a bit lacking because of that. I didn't find it very compelling for that reason. It's basically Tormented Souls Part 2 with a hint of Amnesia the Dark Descent concerning the orb. So, I don't have much to say about the narrative, other than what I just did. It barely suffices for what it does. It's basically just there to be there. Which almost, to some degree, renders the past segments redundant, because their whole point is to connect the narrative. The narrative isn't really worthwhile, at least as far as I'm concerned. So it's like, I know I haven't said much about the narrative, but that's because, to be honest, there's not much to say about the narrative. So there's that. With all that being said, I can tell you that I do actually prefer Tormented Souls to this game, and not by a slim margin either. Now, for anybody, I believe I gave, so time for the final words here. I'll give this game a final grading. This game is not as good as Tormented Souls, and I believe I gave Tormented Souls a B+, which means I can't give this game a B+. So this game suffices for what it does well enough. It was decent enough at what it did, but I wasn't blown away by it in any way. So I've been thinking about this for some time, and I was stuck between a B- and a C+. The gameplay is adequate enough, but due mostly to the fact that this game isn't really scary, like at all. I mean, Tormented Souls is to some degree, isn't to other degrees. So I was gonna give this game a B-. But here's the thing. I don't really have much desire to ever play this game again. I would be more than happy to play Tormented Souls again at some point, but this one, it was a decent playthrough, but I wouldn't care to ever play it again. And for that reason, I just can't give it a better grading. So for my final grade for this game, at least for now, C+. I can't see myself giving it higher than that, since I don't have any desire to play this game ever again. Just to be honest. So, with that being said, the game's above average, and that's all there is to it. So with that being said, that's my review of Fobia St. Dinfna Hotel. I hope you liked it. Maybe you liked the game more than I did. Maybe you liked the less than I did. Who knows? Overall, all I gotta say is that's my review of it. Thank you for your time, and have a nice day. Mwah. I know that was kind of weird, but it is what it is.